When I opened the door and saw him standing there, taller, broader, completely transformed from the boy I used to know, something inside me shifted. Not just recognition. Not even surprise. But an ache I couldn't place, like the past had slipped back into the room in a body it didn't belong to anymore. He smiled, that crooked, familiar smile I remembered from years ago, but it landed differently now. Deeper. Slower. My husband walked past him without a second glance, barely saying hello, already grumbling about work, about something mundane, while I just stood there, holding a dish towel in one hand and my breath in the other. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. The last time, I was holding his little hand at the zoo, trying to keep him from running toward the ice cream cart. Now, he held his own bag over one shoulder, his eyes level with mine, his voice low and unfamiliar. "Thanks for letting me crash," he said. I nodded, but I wasn't thinking about the guest room or the clean sheets I'd just put down. I was trying to understand what I was feeling, and why I couldn't look away. I had no idea that one night would unravel everything I'd spent a lifetime building. But maybe you'll understand. Maybe if I tell you the truth, the whole truth, not the one I tried to convince myself of, you'll see why it happened. And before I start, leave a comment with where you're watching from. Have you ever had a moment where the past came back looking nothing like you remembered, but everything like you needed? It started on an ordinary Tuesday. That kind of day where you forget what you wore, what you ate, what the sky looked like, because nothing about it feels worth remembering. My husband left before sunrise, another early meeting, another rushed goodbye. He always kissed me on the cheek now, never on the lips. I'm not even sure when that changed. At some point, we both just stopped noticing. I stayed in bed longer than usual. The ache in my back was familiar, dull but persistent, and I lay there trying to convince myself to get up. It wasn't the pain that kept me down. It was the weight of another empty day, the kind that echoes quietly around the house when no one's speaking. I checked my phone and saw the message from her, my old friend from college, now living 3 states away. *Hey love. My son is passing through your town for a job interview. Any chance he could stay the night with you guys? Just one night, promise, *. I stared at the name on the screen longer than necessary. Her son. The little boy I used to watch cartoons with when we'd visit each other during the holidays. He couldn't be a little boy anymore. Still, the image I held in my head was the last I'd seen of him, freckles, missing teeth, chocolate-stained cheeks. Of course I said yes. I tidied the guest room even though it was already spotless. I changed the sheets again. Then changed the pillowcases a second time because the first pair didn't match the new duvet. I cleaned the bathroom sink 3 times. I tried to tell myself I was just being polite. A good host. Nothing more. The doorbell rang a little after 5. I'd just started dinner, chicken and something forgettable. My hands were wet when I opened the door, and I wiped them quickly on a dish towel before grabbing the handle. And there he was. Not a boy. Not even close. The kind of presence that filled a space. Sharp jaw, darker eyes, shoulders too broad for the hallway I once carried him down. My throat dried before I said his name. He smiled like we were old friends. "You haven't changed at all." It was a lie. But one I needed to hear. I stepped aside to let him in. "You've changed completely." We stood there for a moment longer than necessary. My husband called from the other room, breaking the moment like a plate dropped on tile. Dinner was awkward only for me. They chatted easily about things I didn't follow, sports, market trends, the sad state of politics. I nodded along, said too little, focused on refilling glasses and clearing plates before they were empty. At some point, I caught myself staring. Not just watching him, but studying. The way he leaned on his elbows when he listened. How his voice lowered just slightly when he turned to speak to me. How he never looked away too quickly. I hated myself for noticing. After dinner, I brought him a towel and showed him the guest room. He looked around like it was more than he expected, said thank you again, his voice soft. You always were the nicest one, he added. I laughed, brushing it off. Don't let your mom hear you say that. He smirked. She knows. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a full minute, staring at nothing. My fingers were curled tightly around the door handle. I don't know why. I just felt something. I went to bed early, even though I knew I wouldn't sleep. My husband came in later, already half asleep, and crawled in beside me with a sigh. He didn't say goodnight. I stared at the ceiling and tried not to think. At 1:14 a.m., I heard the floorboard creak. My heart skipped. Not fear. Something else. I lay still, listening to the soft shuffle of feet down the hallway. The sound of the fridge opening. Water being poured. The dull thud of the door closing again. I sat up. Considered going down for water myself. I was thirsty, I told myself. That's all. But I didn't move. Instead, I got up just before dawn and stood in the kitchen with a mug of tea I didn't drink. When he walked in with barefoot, hair slightly messy, he smiled like we'd both been awake all night. Didn't sleep well, he said. Me neither. We didn't talk much. The morning light felt too soft for words. I handed him a bowl for cereal, and our fingers brushed. He didn't flinch. I didn't either. When my husband came down, the energy in the room shifted. He was oblivious, of course. Asked if anyone saw his phone charger. Complained about a meeting he didn't want to take. Kissed me on the cheek and left without noticing the static in the air. By mid-morning, I found myself checking my reflection in the mirror twice. Once for habit. And once for him. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. My body seemed to know something my mind hadn't accepted yet. I showered, put on makeup I hadn't touched in weeks, and changed my outfit 3 times before settling on something that didn't scream trying too hard, even though I was. My husband had already left for work. He didn't say goodbye. The usual coffee mug was still half full on the counter, the newspaper folded neatly next to it. It was his way of marking territory without ever needing to say anything aloud. I moved through the kitchen slowly, checking the clock too often. I kept listening for footsteps from the guest room. When I finally heard the creak of the door, I tensed without meaning to. Then his voice called out, casual, still sleep-heavy, and I relaxed, though I didn't know why. We didn't eat breakfast together. He came in as I was finishing mine, and I made a second pot of coffee without asking. He thanked me with a nod and sat across the table, his eyes scanning the room like he was memorizing it. For a while, we spoke in comfortable silences. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't really anything. And that was what made it so strange, this weightless familiarity between us, like time hadn't passed, only transformed. Eventually, I asked about his interview. He told me it went well. Better than expected. The way he said it, I knew he was being modest. He'd always been bright. Even as a child, he asked questions other kids didn't. But now there was something else, confidence, or maybe detachment. Like he no longer needed anyone to validate him. He said he had the rest of the day free and would take the bus out in the morning. I nodded, pretending it didn't matter. But it did. More than I understood. He offered to help with errands, and I said yes too quickly. We ended up at the grocery store together, pushing the cart side by side. The simplest things felt different, reaching for the same can of beans, brushing past each other in the narrow aisles, laughing at the same oddly named cereal. I caught our reflection in the freezer door glass, and for one terrifying second, I saw what we looked like, a woman and a man. Not a mother figure and a guest. Not anything innocent. Just two adults moving through the world together like it belonged to them. The ride home was quiet. He played music from his phone, something soft and slow. I didn't recognize it, but it fit the mood too well. I watched the streets pass and tried to slow my breathing. Back at the house, he helped unload groceries. We moved around the kitchen with the rhythm of people used to each other's space. At one point, I reached into a high cabinet and lost my balance slightly. He caught my elbow instinctively. His grip was steady, warm. He didn't let go immediately. "Careful," he said, not smiling this time. "I'm fine," I answered, though my heart was pounding. Later, I pretended to read on the couch while he stepped outside to make a call. I didn't hear much, just his voice, a different tone than the one he used with me. Lighter. Younger. He was probably talking to a friend, someone his age, someone he didn't have to explain anything to. When he came back in, his mood had shifted. A little quieter. Less sure. We watched TV together. Something neither of us cared about. I noticed he sat a little closer this time. Our knees almost touched, and I didn't move mine. I told myself it was nothing. That it only felt like something because I'd been so starved for attention. But it wasn't just that. He asked me questions about my life, things my husband hadn't asked in years. How I spent my time. What I used to dream about. I told him about a painting class I never signed up for, about a garden I wanted to build but never did. He listened like it mattered. And I couldn't remember the last time anyone looked at me that way, like I was still becoming something. At one point, I told a story about my college days. He laughed, leaning back, his head tilted. And then he looked at me differently. Not flirtatiously, not even intentionally. But something passed between us, just for a second. Recognition, maybe. Or longing. I didn't know whose. Dinner was quiet. My husband called to say he'd be home late. I said, okay, like it didn't register, but inside, I felt a tremor. Not guilt. Anticipation. After the dishes were done, I went to the laundry room under the excuse of folding towels. Really, I just needed a moment away. To breathe. To gather myself. I stared at the spinning drum of the dryer and tried to imagine the next day. The moment he'd leave. And how, by then, everything would go back to what it had been before. But that wasn't true. When I returned to the living room, he was sitting on the floor, his back against the couch, legs stretched out. He looked tired, contemplative. I sat down next to him without a word. We watched the window for a while. The sky was beginning to darken. Lights from neighboring houses flickered on. I used to think adults had everything figured out, he said, finally. I chuckled. We don't. We're just better at pretending. He looked at me. Not just a glance, something deeper, a search. And for a moment, I let myself be seen. He reached for the blanket draped over the couch and passed it to me. Our fingers touched again, just for a moment. A spark. Real or imagined, I couldn't tell. But it was there. I should sleep soon, he said quietly. Yes, I replied, even though I didn't want him to go. He stood slowly. I did too. We faced each other in the half-darkness of the room. Neither of us moved. And then, we kissed. We didn't speak after. He turned, walked toward the guest room, and closed the door softly behind him. I stayed in the living room for a long time, unmoving. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator. My lips still tingled. My thoughts raced in 1,000 directions, none of them safe. I didn't sleep that night. And I didn't regret it. Not yet. I barely slept. I lay in bed listening to every sound the house made, every creak of the old floorboards, every gust of wind tapping at the windows, every subtle shift in the air. My husband came home late, as he said he would. I heard the garage door open and close, the soft pad of his feet in the hallway. He peeked into our bedroom but didn't come in right away. I closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep. He sighed, then moved on. Eventually, he joined me in bed, careful not to disturb me. That carefulness said more than words ever could. We had become two people moving through a shared space like ghosts of ourselves, coexisting, not connecting. I lay with my back to him, my eyes wide open, and the space between us stretched like an endless road I no longer had the energy to cross. The next morning arrived sluggishly. I got out of bed and stood in front of the mirror, searching for something in my own reflection, some trace of what I had done or what I was about to do. But my face gave nothing away. My expression was practiced, blank. If you didn't know better, you'd think I was just tired. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of toast and fresh coffee. He was already there. His hair was still damp from a shower, his shirt unbuttoned at the top. There was something effortless about him that morning, and I hated how easily I noticed it. I moved through the morning like I was on autopilot. Made coffee, buttered toast, responded to my husband's small talk with nods and half-smiles. I wondered if he could sense the difference in me. If he could feel the shift in the air like I could. But if he did, he didn't say anything. Later that day, I suggested we take a walk. It was a stupid idea, and I knew it even as I said it. But he agreed without hesitation. Maybe he needed the distraction too. We walked the wooded trail behind the neighborhood, the one that looped around the lake and cut through patches of sun-dappled trees. The late afternoon light filtered through the leaves, painting golden lines across the dirt path. The air was cool, but not cold. The kind of weather that made you want to stay outside just a little longer. We didn't talk much. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was thick with thoughts neither of us said aloud. Every so often, our arms brushed. Once, his hand hovered near mine long enough to make my skin hum. When we reached the bench overlooking the lake, I stopped. I needed a break, not from the walk, but from the swirl of thoughts in my head. I sat down, and he joined me. We looked out at the water, both pretending to be absorbed in the stillness, even though the stillness was only external. He turned to me suddenly. His voice was low, barely more than a murmur. "Do you regret it?" It was a question that didn't name what he meant, but we both knew. I didn't answer right away. I stared at the water, watching a pair of ducks glide across its surface, calm and unbothered. I wanted to be like them, untouched by consequence, free of guilt. "I don't know," I said eventually. And that was the truth. He nodded like he understood. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he just didn't want to push. On the way back, we passed a couple walking a dog. They smiled at us, and I forced a smile in return. I wondered what they saw. Two strangers? A mother and son? A pair who didn't belong to each other? At home, my husband had left for a meeting. The house felt bigger than it had in days. Quiet, too quiet. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the wind stir the leaves in the yard. The silence gave me too much space to think. He came downstairs after a while, holding a photo in his hand. I recognized it immediately, it was one of the old ones from the box in the guest room closet. The one where he was about 8 years old, grinning with missing front teeth, his face smeared with ice cream. I was in the background of that photo, holding a napkin, laughing. "You kept this," he said. "I kept all of them," I replied, my voice soft. He looked at me differently then. Not with desire, not even affection, something more complex. Something that carried weight. Maybe grief. Maybe gratitude. I couldn't tell. That evening, we didn't talk much. He packed his bag slowly, folding each item with care, like ritual. I offered to drive him into the city tomorrow morning so he wouldn't need to deal with the bus. He hesitated, then agreed. We sat at the dinner table again, just the two of us. The light above us buzzed faintly, and the clink of silverware was the only sound. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the spell. But words felt insufficient. After dinner, we washed the dishes together. Our hands moved in rhythm, mine scrubbing, his rinsing. We passed plates and cups without looking at each other. As I reached for the last plate, our fingers touched again. This time, we didn't pull away. The contact lingered, but neither of us moved closer. We just stood there, the warm water running, our hands slightly trembling. "I leave tomorrow," he said. "I know. Will you be okay?" I wanted to laugh. What a ridiculous question. As if I'd ever been okay. "I'll survive." He dried his hands and walked away. I stayed at the sink, gripping the edge hard enough for my knuckles to go white. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, who fell asleep within minutes. I watched his chest rise and fall, the rhythm steady and slow. I felt like an imposter in my own life, a stranger in my own skin. I got up quietly and went downstairs. I sat on the couch in the dark, my arms wrapped around my knees like a child. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just sat there, suspended in the weight of everything I wasn't saying. After some time, I heard footsteps. I didn't turn. He stood behind me, silent for a while. Then, he sat on the floor beside the couch like he had before, his presence grounding but dangerous. Neither of us spoke. In that silence, I felt more than I could ever say. I wanted to apologize. To confess. To pretend none of it had happened. But I did none of those things. I just sat there, with him, in the dark, waiting for the morning. The morning light crept in slowly, the kind that makes the world look quieter than it is. I sat on the couch with my knees tucked under me, feeling the fabric imprint its shape against my skin. He had fallen asleep on the floor at some point, his body curled toward the base of the couch like someone trying to hold on to something in his dreams. I didn't move. I was afraid that if I did, the spell would break and everything would crash down around us. When he finally stirred, I pretended to be asleep. I heard the subtle shift of fabric, the slight intake of breath, the way he hesitated before standing. He didn't say anything. I didn't either. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between us, an acknowledgement, maybe, or a surrender. I stayed there long after he'd gone upstairs to pack. The weight of what hadn't happened felt just as heavy as what had. My hands were cold. My back ached from the awkward position I'd kept all night. But none of it mattered. I wasn't ready to face the day. I wasn't ready to face myself. Eventually, I forced my body into motion. I made coffee without tasting it. I reheated toast I didn't eat. The ticking of the kitchen clock seemed louder than usual. Every sound in the house felt amplified, like it knew something was coming. He came downstairs with his bag slung over one shoulder, freshly showered, looking rested even though I knew he wasn't. There was a heaviness in his eyes that matched the one in my chest. I offered a weak smile, and he returned it with one of his own, tired, tentative. We didn't talk much on the drive. The road into the city felt longer than usual, stretched by our mutual hesitation. I watched the trees blur past, my fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. He tapped at his phone a few times, but mostly he just looked out the window. At a red light, I glanced over. He was staring at nothing, his jaw set, his fingers nervously tugging at the strap of his bag. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, to give us some kind of closure, but I couldn't find the right words. Maybe there weren't any. We pulled up to the curb outside the station. I put the car in park but didn't turn it off. He didn't move to get out immediately. Instead, he looked at me with a softness I wasn't prepared for. "Thank you," he said. I nodded, swallowing hard. "For what?" He paused. "For letting me stay." "For everything." I forced a smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Take care of yourself." He opened the door and stepped out. Before closing it, he leaned in slightly, as if about to say more, but stopped himself. The door shut with a finality that made my chest tighten. I didn't drive off right away. I watched him walk into the station, the way his shoulders carried more than just the weight of his luggage. I waited until he disappeared from view before I let myself exhale. Back home, the silence was deafening. The house felt different now, emptier, but not in a peaceful way. Like something had been extracted from it and the void was still echoing. I wandered from room to room, touching the back of the dining chair he had leaned against, straightening the pillow he'd rested his head on. It was absurd, I knew, but I couldn't help myself. I found the photograph again, the one he had picked up the day before. I stared at it, tracing the outline of the boy's face with my thumb. The boy he used to be. The boy I had once known. The boy who had somehow become a man while I wasn't paying attention. I thought of his words at the lake. "Do you regret it?" At the time, I hadn't been sure. Now, I still wasn't. But I did feel something close to grief. Not over what happened, but over what wouldn't. Over what couldn't. Later, my husband called to say he'd be home early. That we should go out for dinner, maybe try that new place near the park. His voice was upbeat, like he was trying. Trying to reconnect, maybe. Or trying to prove something to himself. I agreed, even though I wasn't hungry. I didn't know how to say no without sounding suspicious. I changed into a dress I hadn't worn in a while, one he used to compliment. I applied makeup with mechanical precision, noting how my hands trembled just slightly. When he came home, he kissed me on the cheek again, his cologne mixing with the familiar smell of printer ink and leather. At the restaurant, we sat across from each other, surrounded by the hum of other conversations and clinking glasses. He talked about work, about how things were picking up, about a new hire he wasn't sure about. I nodded in all the right places, smiled when I was supposed to. At some point, I noticed his gaze linger on me longer than usual. "You look nice tonight," he said. "Thank you." It felt like a performance, both of us reciting lines we barely believed. But I went along with it. I laughed at his stories, asked him questions I didn't care about. I was trying to reclaim something, or at least pretend I hadn't lost it. After dinner, we walked through the park. The air had turned cooler, and I wrapped my arms around myself. He offered his jacket, and I declined. The gesture was sweet, but it felt foreign. Like it belonged to a different version of us. Back at home, I excused myself and went upstairs first. I stood in front of the mirror again, wiping off my lipstick, watching the red smudge disappear into a cotton pad. I stared at my reflection for a long time. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not because she had changed overnight, but because I had stopped seeing her long ago. He joined me in bed later, his presence familiar and heavy. We lay in silence, back to back. I felt the warmth of him but not the connection. The distance between us was no longer physical, it was woven into the fabric of our lives. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. I flinched, even though I knew no one else was there. Or maybe I flinched because of that very fact. As I lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, I realized something. It wasn't just him I missed. It was who I had been in his presence. Seen, desired, alive. And now that he was gone, I didn't know how to go back to the version of myself that had accepted less. The ceiling fan hummed above me, the sound steady and unchanging. But everything else felt like it was shifting beneath my skin. I didn't know what came next. Only that the past few days had rearranged something in me that I couldn't undo. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. The days that followed blurred together in strange, colorless strands. He was gone, and with him, the sudden vibrancy that had briefly cracked through my life. The house returned to its old rhythm, but nothing about it felt familiar anymore. It wasn't emptier. It was just wrong. Like the furniture had been rearranged slightly, or like a song I knew by heart was playing in the wrong key. My husband noticed the shift, though he never said so directly. He hovered around me more than usual, asking questions with a forced lightness that didn't match his eyes. I responded politely, sometimes even fondly, and he seemed satisfied with that, at least on the surface. But I could tell he was watching me now, measuring something he couldn't quite define. I tried to busy myself with things that used to ground me. I cleaned the baseboards. I reorganized the linen closet. I spent nearly an hour deciding what to make for dinner, only to lose my appetite halfway through cooking. I called my sister to ask about her dog's surgery, just to fill the silence with words. But nothing stuck. I was present in the room, but not in myself. The one thing I couldn't do was walk past the guest room without glancing inside. It had already been made up again, fresh sheets, folded towels, blinds drawn just so. Everything looked untouched, like a display in a magazine. But I knew it wasn't. The air still held the echo of him. Sometimes I lingered in the doorway for too long, holding the frame, unsure whether I was holding on or trying to let go. One afternoon, I was putting away winter clothes in the upstairs hallway closet and I found the scarf he'd left behind. Gray wool, frayed at the ends, faintly smelling of cedar and something else I couldn't name. I held it for a moment, fingers pressing into the weave, before tucking it into a drawer and closing it a little too quickly. It felt like hiding evidence. It also felt like holding on to the last piece of oxygen in a room that was slowly running out of air. That evening, my husband came home earlier than usual. He brought takeout from my favorite place, the one we hadn't ordered from in months. He poured me a glass of wine and suggested we watch a movie together. I said yes, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how to say no without having to explain. We sat on the couch, and he reached for my hand. I let him hold it. His thumb brushed over my knuckles slowly, a gesture that once made me feel safe. Now, it only reminded me of how many versions of myself he didn't know. He watched the screen, laughed at the predictable jokes, but I kept my eyes fixed on the space between us, the cushion, the distance, the absence. Halfway through the movie, he paused it and turned to me. "I feel like I've lost you," he said. The words were gentle, not accusatory. Not demanding. Just honest. I looked at him. I didn't know how to lie to his face, not anymore. But I also couldn't give him the truth. "I'm tired," I said instead. He nodded. "I can see that." He didn't press. He just reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture felt kind. Familiar. But it didn't reach the part of me that was aching. Later that night, I lay awake again. He slept peacefully beside me, one arm across his chest, mouth slightly open. I watched him for a long time. He hadn't changed much over the years. Still handsome in that settled, steady way. Still dependable. Still quiet. But I had changed. And I didn't know how to return to the shape I used to fit. The next morning, I went for a walk alone. I took the trail behind the neighborhood again, this time moving slower, more deliberately. The lake was still, reflecting the pale blue of the sky like a mirror that refused to lie. I stood at the same bench we'd sat on, and I let the memory of him fill the silence. I thought of the way he had looked at me, not with ownership, not with expectation, but with attention. I had felt visible in a way I hadn't for years. And now that I knew what that felt like, it was hard to accept anything less. On the walk back, I ran into a neighbor, one I hadn't seen in a while. She asked how I was, how my husband was, if we were still planning that trip we'd once mentioned in passing. I nodded, answered vaguely. She didn't notice the cracks in my voice, and I was grateful. When I got home, the house smelled like toast again. My husband had made breakfast and left a plate for me. There was a note next to it, thought you might be hungry. Love you. I stared at the note longer than necessary. I didn't eat the toast. Later that day, while folding laundry, I found something in the pocket of my husband's jeans, a small receipt, dated the same day he'd brought home the takeout. On the back, in his handwriting, were the words "Don't lose her." I felt my throat tighten. I folded the jeans and placed them neatly on the pile. That night, as I brushed my teeth, I stared at my reflection again. My face looked tired, yes, but also harder. Like I'd seen something I couldn't unsee. Like I'd been touched by a truth too heavy to carry and too stubborn to set down. My husband came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist. I flinched, just slightly, but he didn't notice. He kissed my shoulder and told me I smelled good. I smiled into the mirror, but my eyes stayed flat. When we got into bed, he reached for me again. I let him, but the motions felt hollow. His hands were warm. Familiar. But they didn't spark anything. They didn't make me feel anything but guilt. Afterward, he fell asleep quickly. I stayed awake. I reached for my phone and scrolled mindlessly. Emails. News. Photos. I paused at a picture from 2 years ago, me and my husband at a friend's wedding. We looked happy. I tried to remember what that day had felt like. I couldn't. I thought of sending a message. Just a small one. A check-in. But I didn't. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and turned to the wall. Sleep didn't come easy. And when it finally did, it was shallow and full of dreams I couldn't remember. But I woke up feeling further from myself than ever. I began to notice the little changes before I understood what they meant. The way my husband lingered longer in rooms after I entered. How he started asking questions he used to ignore, about where I'd been, who I'd spoken to, why I hadn't answered his message right away. None of it was said with suspicion. Not overtly. But there was a shift in his tone, a certain heaviness behind his words. He was searching for something, even if he didn't know what it was yet. I responded the way I always had, politely, consistently, without pause. But there were cracks in the rhythm now, spaces where silence stretched too far, where my voice caught for half a second before continuing. And I knew he heard it, even if he didn't say so. I busied myself with routines that felt increasingly meaningless. Grocery lists. Laundry. Dusting the baseboards again. I told myself I was reclaiming normalcy, but the truth was simpler, I was hiding. From him. From myself. From the memory that now lived in the background of every quiet moment. The scarf stayed in the drawer. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I also couldn't bear to touch it again. It existed as proof that something real had happened, even if I was the only one who would ever carry its weight. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the pantry, I found an old birthday card tucked behind a box of unused candles. It was from years ago, signed by my husband, simple and sweet. "To the woman who made my life possible," it said. I stood there for minutes, holding that card, my fingertips tracing the faded ink. I didn't cry. I didn't feel much of anything. Just the quiet hum of recognition that once, a long time ago, we had been real. He came home late that evening, looking exhausted. I asked about his day, and he gave me the usual summary. I nodded, smiled, poured him a glass of wine without asking. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, a movie playing in the background, but neither of us watching. At one point, I glanced over and caught him watching me. Not staring. Not accusing. Just watching, like he was trying to remember something he couldn't quite reach. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I set my glass down. "Just tired." He nodded slowly, like he didn't quite believe me, but wasn't ready to argue. That night in bed, I felt him reach for me again. His touch was hesitant, almost apologetic. I let him, more out of habit than desire. My body responded the way it always had, but my mind was somewhere else, somewhere quiet, distant. I closed my eyes and tried not to think. It wasn't hard. I had practice. Afterward, he turned away and fell asleep quickly. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling. The shadows of the ceiling fan blades spun slowly across the white surface, like the hands of a clock that no longer told time. I woke early the next morning, before the sun rose. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the silence of the house. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to stay. I felt suspended in a space between two lives, one that was slipping away and one that hadn't fully formed. Later, I found myself driving without a destination. I took turns based on instinct, not memory. Eventually, I ended up near the old art supply store I used to visit when I still believed I might take up painting again. It was closed, the windows dusty, a for-lease sign taped inside. I parked anyway, sitting in the driver's seat with the engine off, watching the morning light stretch across the sidewalk. I remembered telling him once, years ago, that I wanted to paint. That I imagined filling canvases with color and texture and the weight of emotion. He had smiled and said, "Then do it." But I never had. Life got in the way. Or maybe I let it. Back at home, I found a package on the front porch. Inside was a book I didn't remember ordering, essays on aging, on identity, on the strange evolution of womanhood. I flipped through it absently, but one sentence caught my eye. It said, "Some losses happen slowly, so slowly you don't know they're happening until they've already taken everything." I closed the book gently, pressing my palm against the cover as if to quiet it. That evening, my husband cooked dinner, something he hadn't done in a long time. He insisted I relax, poured me another glass of wine, told me to sit at the table. I obeyed, partly out of politeness, partly out of curiosity. I watched him move around the kitchen, noting how confident he looked, how comfortable he was in his own skin. For a brief moment, I wondered if maybe we had a chance to reset. He set the plate in front of me and smiled. "You used to love this," he said. I picked up my fork and nodded. "I still do." It tasted like memory, warm and familiar, tinged with something I couldn't quite name. We talked more than we had in days. He asked about my day, really asked. And I told him about the art store, the closed windows, the sign. He asked if I still wanted to paint. I said I wasn't sure. He looked at me thoughtfully and said, "I think you do." It was a simple sentence, but it stayed with me. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized I didn't feel guilty. I felt sad. Not just about what had happened, but about what hadn't. About the spaces I had shrunk myself into, about the parts of me I had packed away quietly over time. I got out of bed and went downstairs. The house was dark, but I didn't turn on any lights. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the sink, listening to the silence. For reasons I couldn't explain, I opened the drawer where I'd hidden the scarf. I unfolded it slowly, pressed it to my face, breathed it in. The scent was fading, but it was still there. Still him. I didn't cry. I just stood there, holding it, knowing something had changed again. And that change was mine. Whether I wanted it or not. The days moved forward with a deceptive smoothness, each one folding into the next like linens too neatly stacked, hiding wrinkles in their corners. But I could feel them, those imperfections, growing heavier with each passing hour. I began to speak less, not out of anger or secrecy, but because I no longer knew how to fill the silence with anything honest. My husband noticed. He didn't say it outright, but it lingered in the way his eyes followed me more often, in how his goodnight kiss started to pause at my cheek as if waiting for me to turn into it. I never did. It was late afternoon when the call came. I was folding towels in the laundry room, the machine humming beneath me, the scent of fabric softener rising like fog. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen since before he arrived. It was his mother. Her voice was as bright as ever, full of anecdotes and updates. She told me he'd arrived safely, that he was settling into his new place, already meeting people, already moving forward. I nodded and made agreeable sounds, even though she couldn't see me. When she asked if he'd behaved himself, I smiled into the empty room and said, of course. He was lovely. After the call ended, I stared at the phone in my hand for several minutes. There was no follow-up message from him. No thank you again. No hope you're well. Nothing. It made sense, of course. But the absence still landed hard. That night, my husband suggested we drive out to the coast. He said it suddenly, like the idea had come to him just that moment, but I suspected it had been brewing for some time. We could rent a little place, just for a night or two. Clear our heads. I agreed before I had time to think of reasons not to. Maybe I wanted to believe that distance could soften something inside me. Maybe I hoped the sea air would rinse me clean. We left the next morning, early. The drive was quiet, not uncomfortable, just filled with the kind of silence that existed between two people who knew each other too well to make small talk. He kept his hand on the gearshift, fingers drumming absently. I looked out the window most of the way, watching the trees give way to open skies. When we arrived, the rental was simple but charming, a small cottage tucked near the cliffs, the kind of place with mismatched dishes and soft blankets that smelled faintly of salt and lavender. I opened the windows immediately, letting the wind move through the rooms like a guest we didn't have to entertain. We unpacked slowly, without urgency. He put on music from a speaker he'd brought, something instrumental and soft, like background breathing. I moved through the space like I was trying to memorize it. Later, we walked down to the beach. It was nearly empty, just a few bundled figures in the distance, and the sky was a dull gray that felt comforting in its simplicity. We sat on a bench facing the water. He reached for my hand, and I let him take it. The wind tangled my hair, and I watched the waves collapse into themselves over and over. He turned to me after a while, his voice quiet but steady. Do you ever think we stopped seeing each other? The question wasn't an accusation. It felt like a confession. I didn't answer right away. I watched the tide pull back, exposing stones and kelp, things usually hidden. Maybe, I said eventually. He nodded. I missed the version of us who used to laugh about nothing. I wanted to tell him that I missed that too, and that sometimes I still did. But I also wanted to say that the version of me who had laughed back then wasn't here anymore. She had changed quietly, over years, and I hadn't even noticed. Back at the cottage, we made dinner together. He chopped vegetables while I stirred a pot of something that didn't matter. We didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't heavy this time. It was shared, like a blanket. Afterward, we sat on the couch, legs tucked beneath us, a glass of wine between us. He leaned in and kissed me. Softly. Familiar. I closed my eyes and let it happen. I didn't resist. I didn't respond. I just allowed it. We kissed. It didn't lead to anything more. He didn't ask for it to. And maybe that was the kindest thing either of us had done for each other in months. We slept in the same bed that night, his arm wrapped around my waist like it used to be. His breathing was steady against my neck, grounding in its rhythm. And for a moment, I felt the shape of something I had almost forgotten, the safety of being held, of being claimed without question. But in the space between wakefulness and sleep, I realized that safety wasn't enough anymore. Not when I'd tasted something else. Not when a part of me had been awakened and couldn't be put back to rest. The next morning, the sun spilled through the curtains with a brightness I hadn't expected. I got out of bed early, stepping onto the porch wrapped in a blanket. The air was cold and sharp. I sat in the wooden chair and watched the sea breathe in and out. He joined me not long after. Sat beside me without speaking. We sipped our coffee, side by side. From the outside, we probably looked like a couple in sync. But on the inside, we were 2 pages in the same book, separated by chapters neither of us had written together. On the drive home, I watched the landscape pass and wondered how long I could keep this version of myself quiet. How long I could exist in this new skin I hadn't chosen but had grown into. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel shame. I felt something quieter, resolve, maybe. A knowledge that I could no longer ignore the pieces of me that had shifted. That evening, when we got home, I went to unpack and found the scarf again, still tucked away, still untouched. I pressed it to my face one last time, inhaled deeply, then folded it and placed it in the donation box by the door. It was time. But not for forgetting. For accepting. Because some things don't go away. They just stop asking to be named. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from the weight of everything that's been left unsaid. That was the silence I began to live in. It settled into the walls of the house, into the way the curtains moved when the windows were open, into the quiet clink of silverware during meals where our words had become mostly practical. The trip to the coast didn't fix anything. It didn't reignite us or erase what had been done. It simply gave us a glimpse of what trying could look like. And while there was comfort in the attempt, I knew, deep down, it wouldn't be enough. Not now. Not after I had tasted something I hadn't even known I was starving for. I found myself returning to old routines, only now, I was watching them more than living in them. I noticed how I folded my clothes with mechanical precision, how I cleaned the counters before they had a chance to get dirty. I watched the way my husband stood at the sink, his posture curved forward just slightly, the way it had been for years. These were the details of a life I had built. A life I had once cherished. But I had changed. Quietly. Unforgivably. That week, I signed up for the painting class. It was a small studio on the east side of town, mostly retirees and one awkward college student who kept to himself. I went twice a week. I didn't tell my husband at first, not because I was hiding it, but because I wasn't ready to explain why it mattered. At the studio, I felt anonymous. I liked that. The teacher didn't ask about my background or why I was there. She just handed me a blank canvas and said, "Start with shape." So I did. I painted slowly, unsurely, letting colors speak in ways I couldn't. I found myself reaching for muted blues and rusted oranges, tones that didn't match the mood I was trying to fake at home. Each brushstroke felt like an admission, even if no one else could read it. One morning, my husband asked where I had been. I told him about the class. He blinked, surprised, and then smiled in that way people do when they realize you've been keeping something gentle from them. "That's great," he said. "I'm glad." And maybe he was. Maybe he even meant it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't know how to fit into this new version of me that was unfolding without his permission. Later that day, I received a letter. A real one, envelope, stamp, familiar handwriting. My name written carefully on the front. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. My heart beat faster than I wanted it to. It wasn't long. Just a few sentences. Asterisk, I wasn't sure if I should write. I didn't want to disrupt anything. But I wanted to say thank you. For letting me see a different version of myself, even if only briefly. I won't reach out again. I just wanted you to know you mattered, asterisk. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the back of the drawer beneath my sweaters. Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't know what to do with something that gentle. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling around the idea of versions. Who we become with others. Who we let ourselves be when no one's looking. And I realized something that unsettled me. I didn't miss him the way I thought I would. I missed myself, the one I had been when I was with him. The woman who had felt seen, not because someone looked at her, but because she had stopped hiding. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror for longer than usual. I wasn't looking for flaws. I was looking for signs. Had I really changed? Or was I just finally paying attention? I tied my hair back, pulled on a simple sweater, and made myself breakfast without waiting for him to join me. When he did, he seemed surprised that I had started without him. I offered a small smile. He sat down and poured his coffee. We talked about the news, about his work, about whether or not we should fix the gutters before winter. Later that afternoon, I found the box of scarves I had planned to donate. I opened it, gently moving the fabric aside until I found the one. His. Still folded, still holding its shape. I lifted it, pressed it to my face for the briefest second, then carried it out to the porch. The sun was beginning to set, casting the house in golden shadow. I walked to the bin by the curb and placed the scarf gently inside the donation bag. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't cathartic. But it felt right. Not like forgetting. More like releasing. Back inside, I washed my hands slowly, watching the water swirl into the drain. My husband called from the living room to ask if I wanted to join him for a movie. I told him I'd be there in a minute. When I sat down beside him, he reached for my hand again. I let him hold it. His grip was warm, steady. Familiar. We watched something forgettable. I didn't pay attention to the plot. My thoughts wandered. But I stayed there with him. I didn't pull away. And in that moment, I realized something else. I wasn't waiting for the past anymore. I wasn't measuring every moment against something fleeting. I was simply present. Not because I had forgiven myself. Not because I had healed. But because I had stopped running. And maybe, for now, that was enough. There are moments that define a season of your life not because they're extraordinary, but because of how ordinary they are. You find yourself washing dishes and realizing the weight of everything you've been carrying no longer drags you under. You pass by the mirror and stop, not to criticize or assess, but simply to see. You breathe in, and for once, it feels enough. That's how things began to feel, not resolved, not redeemed, but lighter. And I didn't trust it at first. In the mornings, my husband would linger at the table with his coffee longer than usual. He started asking more questions, not intrusive ones, but real ones. He noticed my painting class, even asked to see what I was working on. I showed him a half-finished canvas of abstract lines and muted tones. He looked at it for a while before nodding and saying, "It feels like you." It was a small thing, but it lodged itself in me like a seed. I hadn't expected recognition. I hadn't asked for it. And yet, when it came, it softened something inside. Still, there was a quiet undercurrent. A tension that hadn't left. He had grown more attentive, more careful, but something in him was watching me, my movements, my expressions. As if searching for a crack in the glass he couldn't name. I could feel it in the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence, or glanced at me when he thought I wouldn't notice. I wasn't sure what he suspected. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. One day, as I was clearing out the guest room closet, I found a bracelet. Simple. Delicate. Not mine. My heart stopped, then restarted with a strange flutter. I turned it over in my hands slowly. It had likely slipped between the cushions or under a nightstand during his stay. I held it as if it were fragile, though it wasn't. There was nothing remarkable about it except the memory it carried. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, the sunlight catching on the thin gold as it twisted between my fingers. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I placed it in the drawer of my nightstand without ceremony, without note. I didn't tell my husband. But I caught him looking at me differently that night. We were in the living room, reading, him a novel, me flipping through an art book without focus. At some point, I looked up and found his eyes on me. He didn't look away. He asked, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" It wasn't a trap. There was no malice in it. Just a kind of quiet fatigue, the voice of someone who had asked the same question in his own head too many times. I closed the book slowly, placed it on my lap. I didn't answer immediately. I didn't lie. But I also didn't confess. "Sometimes I feel like I've been sleepwalking for years," I said. He nodded, as if he understood. Or maybe that wasn't the answer he was looking for. But he didn't ask again. Later that week, I found myself parked outside the grocery store without remembering the drive there. I sat in the car, engine off, hands still on the wheel. The bracelet was in my pocket, its presence too loud to ignore. I didn't know why I'd taken it with me. Eventually, I drove to the donation center. I handed over a box of clothes I'd been meaning to drop off for weeks. At the last second, I slipped the bracelet into the folds of an old scarf and closed the lid. Letting go, again. This time, without the need to watch it happen. That evening, I made dinner, nothing elaborate, just something warm. My husband joined me in the kitchen, chopping vegetables without being asked. We moved around each other easily, almost rhythmically, like we had in better years. At one point, his hand brushed mine while reaching for the salt. We both paused, but neither of us pulled away. After dinner, we sat on the back steps with mugs of tea wrapped in separate blankets, side by side. The sky was the soft pink of endings. The air smelled of distant wood smoke. He shifted closer, not touching, just near enough to notice the space between us had shrunk. "I've been thinking about taking some time off work," he said. I glanced at him, surprised. "You never take time off." "I know. Maybe that's the problem." I didn't respond, but I nodded. I could feel something rebuilding between us, quietly, slowly, not from romance or forgiveness, but from honesty. From showing up even when it felt easier to stay hidden. That night, as we got ready for bed, he paused at the door of the guest room. Just stood there, hand resting on the frame. I stopped behind him, uncertain. "Strange how empty a room can feel," he said. I didn't know if he meant it as a question or a statement. But I felt the weight of it anyway. He turned to me, looked at me for a long time, then stepped back into our bedroom without saying more. I followed. We lay in bed, the room filled with the soft sounds of the night, crickets, whined through the trees, the occasional creak of old wood. He didn't reach for me this time. And I didn't expect him to. We slept without touching. But something in the silence between us had shifted again. It no longer felt like distance. It felt like space. Space to breathe. To begin. To decide. The next morning, I woke before the sun. I went downstairs, barefoot, wrapped in a sweater. I made tea and opened the front door. The world was still asleep, and the quiet was kind. I sat on the porch and watched the sky lighten. And in that stillness, I felt something settle in me, not closure, not clarity, but acceptance. What had happened wasn't gone. But I was no longer afraid of what it meant. And for the first time in months, I didn't look back. Time, it turns out, doesn't heal everything. It smooths some edges, lets others become sharper, and sometimes simply leaves things as they are, quiet, unremarkable, still marked by what came before. I learned to live in the spaces left behind. Some days, they felt wide as the ocean, others, narrow as the seam of a closed door. Autumn came early that year. The trees outside our window turned red and gold almost overnight, as if the world was impatient for change. I found myself lingering by the glass in the mornings, cup of tea in hand, watching leaves fall in slow spirals. There was a peace in that, the kind that comes from knowing something is ending, even if you're not sure what will replace it. My husband and I began to rebuild, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with small, consistent kindnesses. He remembered how I took my coffee, brought it to me without fanfare. I started asking about his work again, listening for real answers instead of routine ones. We spent more evenings together, sometimes watching television, sometimes just sharing the quiet. There was less expectation, less performance. We were two people relearning each other's language, finding comfort in simple words. The painting class became my refuge. I finished one canvas, then another, each one a little braver, a little less afraid of color. Sometimes I painted at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across my work, my husband passing by and pausing to look. Once, he said, "I never knew you could do this." I shrugged, but inside, I was blooming. I saw my reflection differently now. I no longer searched for the woman I used to be. I let her go piece by piece, like the leaves falling from the trees. I welcomed the woman who was left behind, the one who had lived through mistaken desire, guilt and awakening, and had not been destroyed by it. There were days when I missed him, not as a person, but as a possibility. I wondered how his life was, whether he was happy. But those thoughts came less frequently, and without the old ache. Sometimes, a certain song would play, or I'd catch the scent of cedar and pause, but I didn't dwell there. I let the memory pass, like weather. One morning, as I was sorting through old photos, I found one of the three of us, Emmy, my husband, and our guest, taken on the porch that summer. We were laughing, caught off guard by something my husband had said. I looked at the faces in the photograph, trying to remember the joke, but all I felt was gratitude for the moment itself. Not what came before, not what came after. Just the moment. My husband walked in and saw me holding the photo. He smiled and sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. "You've changed," he said, not accusing, not questioning, just noticing. "I hope so," I replied. "I needed to." He nodded. There was nothing more to say. We sat together, watching the light shift across the table. Later that afternoon, we took a walk around the neighborhood. The air was cool, crisp, full of the promise of winter. We passed neighbors raking leaves, children racing each other down the sidewalks. My husband reached for my hand. I took it, surprised by how natural it felt. At dinner that night, I set the table with our best dishes. It wasn't a holiday, but it felt like one. We ate slowly, savoring the food and the conversation, laughing over old stories and new ones. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was performing. I was simply present, as myself, no more and no less. As the days shortened and the nights grew longer, I found myself looking forward, not back. The past remained with me, shaped me, but no longer dictated my choices. I understood now that forgiveness, of myself and of others, wasn't a single act, but a series of small decisions. To stay. To try again. To see the person in front of me, and let myself be seen. I finished another painting and hung it in the hallway. It was bright, full of hope and tension, a story told in color rather than words. Every time I passed it, I smiled. Sometimes, when I couldn't sleep, I sat on the porch and watched the stars appear, one by one. I would close my eyes and breathe in the night air, feeling the quiet settle inside me. And when I finally returned to bed, my husband would stir, reach for my hand in the dark. I would take it, holding on, not to what we once were, but to what we had become. That was enough.